really excited to be here today, and I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. It's great for us as Projekt202 to be included as part of the third cohort. This group of startups is actually how I found out about the 5G Open Innovation Lab. I had some great colleagues who I admire who were part of the first cohort. So we're really excited to be able to talk to you today. We did bring a few slides, so we're going to show a deck to kind of guide us through that, and
Sure.
colleague Andy is going to share. So let's pull that up, and we can start from there.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, let me know if you guys can see it.
We can.
That's great. Just max us out as much as you can, Andy.
That's as max as it goes.
Great. Super. So we're Projekt202, and we'll jump to the second slide. When we met with Jim to talk about meeting with the roundtable, he identified a couple of themes. Andy, can you jump to the second slide?
I am on the second slide.
Okay.
We are not seeing that update.
Yeah, there's a lag. Or
There you go.
there we go. So Jim identified some themes, and these were really areas that he thought we could talk about to you guys today, and they were really good ideas for us. One is about ways of working. It's really about building the right thing. The second one is about really designing for user outcomes, which is a mindset. And the third and final one is the role of experience in building trust. And these three things laddered up to, I think, be good themes both for you and ways for us to share with you who we are. This is our ethos, if you can see slide 3 here, that says business results in people's lives are always improved by the same thing. And that's building experiences that matter. Our organization is a collection of researchers, strategists, designers, technologists, and program managers who are all engaged in this larger mission. And you're going to hear us talk a lot about this word experience today. Andy, we can jump to the next slide. Experience is really just the layer that connects a person to a system or a process or a tool or a business or a piece of technology. And that's what we do. We are leaders in experience-driven design and innovation. We are just about to complete our second decade at doing this work. And really what sets us apart is leading with the needs of people. And we do this all the way from insights to implementation. So we think about doing the research and the design work, but we also understand what it takes to deliver, most frequently in the case of technology, but sometimes in an instance where technology is just an enabler. And our focus is really on creating experiences that customers and employees deserve to do their work. And that's where there's a powerful way for us to make and have impact from our Seattle office. A couple of us will be presenting, probably all of us will be leaning in and sharing a little bit today. And then also Fadi Dajani is here today, and he's part of the global organization. So we're really excited to talk to you today, and we're going to cover off on that first theme. So I'll pass it over to you, Andy.
Yeah, give me just a sec. It's not updating, so I'm going to try a different way to screen share real quick.
Great.
All right, which screen are you guys seeing?
The slides.
Okay. And did you see it update to a gray slide saying building the right thing?
Not yet.
Ah.
Hey, Andy, sometimes it helps with the Teams to share the entire desktop. I know, it shares the entire thing that way, and you can go into different slides.
All right.
Sorry in advance, guys, for the Teams challenges.
It's all good.
Let me swap it.
Cool.
There we go.
Can you guys see it updating between the two slides now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's much better.
All right, so building the right thing. If you kind of think about this, this little bar here as projects that are started, right? So software projects that companies have started on. About 20% of those projects actually make it to production. The bottom of this, those little lines, that's the business, design, and tech. And what you'll see there is, the business will work on something for a while and kind of pass it to design, and design will pass it to the technology team. And so what this translates to, right, is these business requirements really end up being a bunch of assumptions about users. And by the time we get to the build stage, since the team wasn't involved in that process, churn starts to happen, right? They don't know quite how to connect what they're building to the end user experience. They're not quite sure why the business reasons they're building what they're building. And so when they move into that test cycle, those test cycles become really expensive, right? Because you've got entire technology teams engaged at this point. And at the end, when you get to launch, oftentimes what would happen is you would find out that, well, you've actually built the wrong thing. So then Agile came along. Agile taught us to fail faster. The idea was to, build and test in smaller increments and more frequently. So you'll see the process is really about the same. The only difference is that build and test process, we're just, building and testing smaller things. So we're finding out what's not working a little bit faster. We're still making assumptions about user. We're still seeing team churn, and the test cycle is still relatively expensive because we're still engaged with full technology teams, and oftentimes we still end up finding out that we built some of the wrong things, maybe not as wrong, but. So this is the common pattern that we see today. So still we're collecting some business requirements. But now we've moved design a bit forward in the process, and we're doing prototypes and user testing those. And then we move into a build phase, and we test and launch. Everything else there is the same. So you'll see, with today's pattern, we've moved design and development and really cross-team collaboration up a bit in the process, and we're seeing more engagement across those projects. We're still making assumptions about users. There's still team churn. And often during this prototype, we're still making a lot of iteration because we are still prototyping based on a bunch of assumptions about users. Then we will move into build and test. Oftentimes we won't actually still engage the technology teams until much later, right? And so oftentimes design intentions will get lost in that process. And so this is really a bit more where Projekt202 sits. What we are really trying to push people to do is test their problem and hypothesis and really let users feedback dictate the solutions that we create. So that means that we're coming up with a hypothesis. We're actually testing that hypothesis, and then we move into a prototype phase. Then we're testing that, we're building, we're testing, and then we're launching. And so what that translates to from a team perspective is we're trying to really get that cross discipline collaboration happening much earlier and keep it going throughout the entire process. And so what that means, right, is instead of making a bunch of assumptions about users right up front, we're actually backing into those user pains and needs right out of the gate. So our requirements, instead of starting with the requirements, we start with the user need and we back into it, which translates to by the time we get to prototypes, there's, those iterations become smaller, more affordable iterations. And when we get to the build phase, what we actually end up with is an empowered team that's really able to make educated decisions about the products that they're building. And so, all in all, that kind of translates to the Projekt202 methodology. We have a revealing reality phase that really, if we kind of back up, that's really kind of that first circle loop that happens. Focused innovation, which is really about building concepts. Build and Evolve, which was more about the build phase and launching. So next, we will chat about designing for user outcomes, and I'll hand it over to Nathan for a minute.
Yeah, and hi, my name is Nathan Smith. I'm a director of technology here at Projekt202 in Seattle. Before I dive into this, want to pause for a second, right? I think we've got a relatively, good crowd here, and wanted to understand, right, if there's questions or comments or some discussion that we want to have.
Yeah, Nathan, I had a question, if you don't mind me asking, which is Jeff Lawson, who's one of the founders of Twilio, recently wrote a book called Ask Your Developer. And the thesis of that was for companies to become differentiated, they really need to create more software in whatever it is that they do, right? If you're in logistics, you build kind of your own differentiated software around that part of the business, or whatever the industry is. And from our conversations, and as I've been learning a lot more about Projekt202, it's become pretty obvious to me with some of the clients that you've worked with that is sort of the direction that they're going. So one is I wanted to ask, is that true? Are more enterprises actually bringing software development in-house? And if true, then two, how are they changing their approach to evaluating new software as part of bringing on new software from outside, third-party software into the mix of their IT strategy?
Yeah. So a couple of comments there. Like, first, that is a great book, and anybody who hasn't read it, it is worth the time. Twilio is a fascinating company, right? And because their space is focused on delivering software products to enable and empower engineers and developers, they've got a really interesting perspective on that as well, right? So a lot of enterprises out there, right, are delivering software aimed at consumers or aimed at sort of empowering employees. Like Twilio's, like where they live, and that is empowering developers. And so I think that gives them a pretty sophisticated view of some of the changes to processes and methodology that can really help empower effective delivery. I thought one of the most fascinating sort of nuggets of wisdom in Jeff's book, right, was the concept of ask your developers. If you want to know, right, what you need to build, right, what's going to empower your customers, right, and create great products, ask your developers. And I'd say that's like perfectly aligned with like our way of thinking and sort of the story that Andy's telling here, like bringing developers into, right, the design process, right, and creating that sort of fully blended cross-functional team from the start, right, is crucial to delivering sort of high quality products. And then I think the last point I'll comment on was your question, like, are companies bringing more software development in-house? And I think the answer is it depends. But I think what we're, regardless of like the sourcing model, I think what we're seeing is that software is becoming an increasingly important part of most kinds of companies' businesses, right? Whether you're in the retail industry, like 20 years ago, right, you thought of e-commerce as separate, right? It was a separate business area. It was something that was nice to have, right? It was an adjunct business. It did 4% of your total sales volume, and now it is just part. It's the way that commerce is done, right? I think that that's true in financial services, right? Banking products are increasingly, right, software delivered, software empowered, software enabled, and so I think that part of the thesis is true, right? That developing mature software delivery processes, right, is crucial to your business's success, regardless of what kind of business you are.
Got it. Okay, and then part of Jeff's thesis as well around Ask Your Developers was that certain aspects of software development, or let's say specific needs, are best done by third parties, right? Not necessarily. You don't want to be a master of all. You really want to just be a master that's unique to your industry. And so take, for instance, Disney, who looked like to be a client of Projekt202. From your experiences, guys, how does Disney evaluate what types of software externally, third-party software, and that they would need, and how do they go about doing that? Because as you can imagine, CIOs or folks who are deciding on what to purchase from a software perspective are likely very inundated with requests on a daily basis. So I'm just keen to get your perspective, what you've seen your clients do in terms of evaluating third-party software as part of their mix.
Yeah. So again, I'll give the standard sort of consulting answer of, it depends, right?
Yeah.
But I think sourcing strategies, are varied, right? And sometimes, I think it depends on sort of what companies view as their core competency and what they view as what is feasible for them to deliver, right? And that's actually a topic we'll be getting into a little bit more in the next section as well, like that feasibility. But sometimes we work with enterprises, right, who really value having an outside perspective, right? And the outside perspective, right, is value in and of itself, right? Having folks who can look in from the outside, who haven't gone completely native, who aren't as necessarily bound, right, by some of the practices and constraints or perceived constraints, all right, of the current state, right, can help them innovate faster, right?
Totally understand.
And sometimes we work with companies that need to augment their skill sets in interesting ways, right? They may not have great user experience or user design capabilities in-house, right? And are looking for outside help, right, to deliver those types of skills, right? And sometimes we work with companies that have a core set of software products that they view as core competencies, and they hold on to those tightly, but have maybe adjacent products or adjacent services that they're more comfortable, right, allowing a broader ecosystem to participate in, right? So I think it depends a lot. I think there's a lot of different reasons, right, for companies to leverage different types of sourcing strategies, and I think we've seen them all.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Those are some really great points, Nathan. I think another important part of interacting with a third party is the third party's ability to focus, and focus in a different way. A lot of times when you see an internal team, they're working on something that's like an inch wide and a mile deep. And a lot of times when we're collaborating with a team, it's the converse, right, where we're going really broad. I think there's other engagements where what you see this third party brought in for, especially in these technology spaces, is to do work that helps accelerate an internal team. So we can do work at lower fidelities with unique ways of working that allow us to essentially plot out the type of development that an internal team might spend the next 2 years focused on. And if the internal team tries to do that on their own, that can take a long time. That's something we can get done in a quarter with a really small, tight engagement. So I think that's one thing. I can think of another example we have currently right now about like a retail customer that we're working with, and they're thinking about internal tools. And as they look about what they could potentially buy, what they see are constraints on the experience that they can deliver to their customers. And what happens there is they start to think about, well, what should they maybe consider building? And once they think about building it, that allows them to sort of unleash the exact experience that they want to have to connect their brand, their business, their employees, and their customers. And then sometimes there's a lot of gray area in between, but that's another arena in which we're both helping to steward that process, as well as coming in and either working with them shoulder to shoulder, sometimes independently, and then sometimes we're embedding one of our people within an internal organization. So we're very flexible about those ways of working, because in general, design, technology, and to certain extents, research are all practices that large organizations are starting to stand up internally. So that becomes a great opportunity for us to work with them and help them kind of either pull focus, whether it's looking out or getting something done very quickly, or thinking in ways that are sort of liberated from the constraints that the company has itself.
Makes sense. Thank you. That's great insight. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so let's dive into kind of the next section here, right? So, designing for user outcomes. Andy, that's actually a slide I added this morning. I'm sorry, I confused you. Yep. So I want to call back to one of the diagrams that Andy had showed earlier, right? Which is having this sort of fully blended cross-functional team participate throughout the entire development process, right? And it's relatively easy to say, but it's a little bit hard to do in practice, right? Bringing together and keeping a cross-discipline team together throughout the entire life cycle, right, can be hard, right? Establishing like the common goal often isn't quite enough, right? you often need to sort of overcome the fact that people are coming from different backgrounds and practicing different crafts, and they don't speak the same language, right? They don't have the same methodology. And you need to sort of establish, right, those norms, right, to allow folks to collaborate and communicate effectively. And one of the set of methods that's been used to address this, right, is something called design thinking, right? And it was created for exactly this purpose, right? It's a set of methods and practices and perspectives that allow folks who don't come from a design background to participate in and practice design disciplines. And as a technologist, I can appreciate that, right? I don't come from a design background. I come from an engineering background. And so I really appreciate these sorts of frameworks, right, for helping me, adopt this sort of mindset. And this is nothing new, right? I think design thinking was coined back in the 60s. But really over the last decade or decade and a half, right, we've seen it start to get applied more and more in the software development domain, and specifically to that sort of product ideation and innovation domain, right? And next slide, right? One of the frameworks, right, in design thinking, right, is this one right here, right? And it's sort of the innovation process. And sort of what this sort of proposes, right, is that, success lies at the center of desirability, viability, and feasibility, right? That's where success is. It's at the center of desirability, feasibility, and viability, right? Where desirability is essentially, is this a solution that people want? And feasibility is this a solution that we could actually pull off and do? And viability is this a solution that we should actually pull off and do? And a lot of times we think about that in terms of like company financials, like, is this going to be a profitable product? But I think we need to take a slightly broader look at that, right? I think it's also got to include some of the externalities like impact on the world and on society, right? And is this something that is going to ultimately be good, right, for my company, for the world that we live in as well. And so I was thinking about this framework, this particular framework, and then I thought about this in relation to a different framework. And Andy, if we go to the next slide. So back in like 2012, I believe, Ray Itamoto at South by Southwest proposed this model, right? Which is, these are the 3 types of roles that need to exist on any successful startup team, right? You need a hipster, you need a hustler, you need a hacker. And he sort of said hipsters are the creatives, right? These are the people that are the ones driving sort of the ideation and the innovation. They're trying to make sure that products are, they look pretty, and that generally they work well, and that they're just generally pretty cool, right? Whereas hustlers are like they're the business owners, right? They're the ones who are really focused on the outcomes, right? They may be prioritizing some of the ideas and trying to shape them into a roadmap. They may be playing a little bit of that product owner role, but they're also usually very deeply involved in the marketing and the positioning from a sales perspective of the product. And finally, the hackers, right, are the ones who are, and I'm a technologist, so I'm biased here, right? They're the ones doing the real work. We're the ones who are who are disappointing the hipsters and hustlers by actually trying to build real things, and trying to deal with constraints like the laws of physics or the number of hours in a day. And so there's real overlap, I think, between this model, right, and the design thinking model. And if there's a thing that I love more than a framework, it's a framework that allows me to compare frameworks. And so when you look at this, right, if you sort of lay the 2 models side by side, right, there's a ton of overlap. But I think the thing that really jumped out to me, right, was the key difference, right, and that is that hip or cool is not the same as desirable or useful. And I think that is crucial. Like, those things are not the same, at least in the long term. Like in the short term, right? Cool might be the basis for a splashy product launch or a nice product release, but it's not going to be the basis for a satisfied customer or a sustainable business, right? And we think that there's a slight sort of change to this model a little bit. Like I think if we go to the next slide, if you sort of change in the mindset, right, that role of a hipster with a humanist, right, somebody who is a deep student of humanity, right, who is trying to understand and has deep empathy for their customer and understand what customers actually will find useful and gain value from, as opposed to what is cool or interesting or unique. Like that small sort of change in mindset, right, we think can lead to radically different outcomes in terms of overall sort of software development, right, and success, right. And so the question then becomes, how do you turn a hipster into a humanist? And that's by shifting the focus, right? By stopping, by putting less focus on thinking about the product and putting more focus on thinking about what are the user outcomes. And Rob tells a story here that I'm going to steal shamelessly about USAA, right? So USAA, financial services company, and it's relatively unique in the financial services industry for actually delighting and surprising and pleasing their customers, right? And in banking and insurance and investment, customer satisfaction are not generally sort of they're not always synonymous, right? But USAA, is renowned for that, right? And one of the changes that they made a couple of years ago was they stopped referring to their people as product owners, and they started referring to them as experience owners. And on the surface, a lot of the activities that that role does are not radically different, right? They're still participating in those same sorts of activities. The tasks that they do may be slightly changed, but the perspective is radically different. They're thinking less about, what is my product roadmap, and they're thinking more about what are the changes to the experience and to the journey that I'm enabling and bringing my customers through. And the change in perspective, leads to slightly different execution in the way that you do some of those tasks and activities, and that leads to, I think, radically different outcomes in terms of creating sustainable and successful products. And so here's where I'm going to give the mic back over to Andy to sort of talk how we apply that sort of thinking, and sort of what are some of the activities and tasks that we do, right, to help be focused on those user outcomes.
Yeah. So we'll start by kind of focusing on the user part of user outcomes, right? So these are all different deliverables that kind of progress from one to another. The first one being user segmentation, right? So these are generic subdivisions of a total addressable market. They're usually defined by demographics. And as we graduate that, right, what we start to do is add some assumptive representations of how customers or users behave. We talk about those at Projekt202 as provisional archetypes. And then that eventually sort of shifts into personas, and reality-based personas. The reality part is a big key of it. And really that's a grouping of users with similar behaviors. And we base that on data that we've gathered quantitatively and qualitatively. And then if we focus on outcomes, right, some of the deliverables for focusing on outcomes are data-backed journey maps. So this means building journeys that are based on data gathered through those interviews and observations. And then we graduate that to a service blueprints, which is really a collection of business and technology touch points that are aligned with that journey map. And then we graduate that to a reality-based backlog, right? So the idea here is that we use that service blueprint as sort of a foundation to start generating our user stories and backlogs, so that long term what we're looking at is a backlog and a delivery plan that really ensures that we're building based off that user need and pain. And so what that eventually translates to, right, is we have user-led planning. So instead of forcing users to adapt to the business and technology problems, we end up ideating and building solutions around the user's experience right from the get-go. We end up with empowered teams. So, the teams that really build those user outcomes end up becoming your leaders across multiple work streams. And they have all the information available to them to make great product decisions. And they're carrying that forward with the rest of the team and supplying them with that information as well. We also end up with reduced risks. So instead of finding out about our solutions breaking at launch. We slowly increase that fidelity over time and ensure that we're delivering the right thing from ideation to the delivery of a product or service. And so to repeat what Nathan said, right, what we're really trying to do here is transform from building, what we think is hip into what we know is desirable. Any questions or comments?
I had a few, but let me ask the team first if they had any. If not, I could jump in. Any questions, guys, from folks in the startups? Okay. One of the big questions that I have, guys, is that as we talked about in our first meeting, the opportunity in 5G is really ubiquitous, right? Beyond the connectivity, which is fantastic, there's this opportunity for user experiences and compute located nearby. And some enterprise customers are really looking at that as a differentiation. And that could materialize as, private 5G networks and using localized compute to transform, or rather collect and process data on site and all this other fun stuff. But I'm curious to see, now that you guys are part of Amdocs, what type of 5G user experiences that your teams have been chatting with some clients on? If you have a view into that, or you can give us a peek into it, I'm curious to know what type of user experiences people are experimenting with that are essentially enabled by future 5G networks.
So Nathan, Windtalker comes to mind, but I feel like you speak about that a little better than me.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit broader than that, though. Like, I don't want to speak sort of so much about a specific client. So I think, and Fadi can back us up on some of these things. But I think some of the use cases that we deal with are fairly well known, right? It's the sort of connected city kind of IoT type of increased sensor deployments, right? Both in the public sector sort of and within sort of the enterprise itself, right? I think that's a use case that people are very excited about. I think there is certainly sort of the raw sort of connectivity element of it, and sort of tying that back to kind of that viability concern, right? And the not just the impact, right, on your company's finances, but on the world. Like, one of the very real things about that is that not all 5G connectivity is equal, right? The fact that there's multiple different transports, right, that offer, not only different speeds and feeds, but candidly, like radically different empowering sort of functionality, right? I think is something that's really, interesting to sort of take a look at. And some of the customers that we're talking to, right, are super interested in trying to deliver products or services that enable those capabilities, kind of at the edge of the network, where to try to sort of flatten out a little bit of those digital divide capability, or that may emerge, right? So there's a class of folks who are super interested in sort of trying to ensure ubiquitous services, right, even in a very heterogeneous kind of environment, right? As I'm thinking, Fadi, do you want to jump in with some of the other use cases that you may have top of mind?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. Thanks for the question.
Sure.
Obviously, it's one of those things that keeps coming up, right? What's 5G going to be utilized for? And there's the obvious cases from healthcare applications to smart transportations to the stadium example where there's analysis happening on the fly on the players and their stats and what they can do to improve the game. And I think it comes down to the experience between all these different ideas, right? How are you going to connect these ideas together? What's that layer that's gonna be the intersection point between a smart city and smart transportation and smart health? I think that's where it gets very interesting, and that's where those unique things that we haven't heard of has room to grow still. There's it's definitely every day we're coming across new use cases, but it's still within the realm of what we heard. You've heard of different cases, we've heard of some, but I think those intersecting points on how you connect them together and build the experience between them is where it gets very interesting.
Yeah, Fadi, thank you for pointing that. Kurt had a question that you wanted to ask, but if you don't mind, Kurt, just one additional point. Okay. Yep. So I used to work at PeopleSoft and Oracle before joining Microsoft in 2005, and in that time I built a lot of relationships with CXOs in various different industries and enterprises. And I was catching up with a longtime friend of mine and sharing with him the work we're doing here at the 5G lab. And he said to me, 5G scares me. And I said, why would 5G scare you? And he said, look, we work so hard to understand our enterprise data. But if you really think about it, there's just a few streams of data coming in that we can make sense of, right? We throw a Tableau or a Power BI or whatever on top of it, and we can understand that data. Well, 5G, that constraint goes away. Like, we could literally have thousands of sensors and all these other different systems. And so we are scared, he was scared about being over inundated with the amount of data, and not only understanding it, but how can he move that data from being a reporting source to more of a transactional proactive source. And that was what kind of scared him, was this whole idea that the restrictions that we have today in terms of enterprise data coming in actually go away in 5G. If you think about it, right? If we do hit 1 trillion devices on the internet in the next 10 years, all essentially creating data and reporting data, how do you make sense of that? And one of the projects, Rob, that you shared with me early on in our first conversation was helping a client actually make sense of a lot of the data that they were ingesting and moving that from just silos of data to more actionable data as well. And so I'm curious to see if you're also seeing several rather similar sentiments from customers. But how do they prepare for what could be an onslaught of new insights, right, and new experiences?
So I'll just jump here, Jim, referring to 3 customers that are very advanced in that space that we're working with.
Okay.
I think the major thing that changed is, although it's a mainly B2B play, they're looking at the user enablement, the end user enablement.
Right.
And that's their focus right now, because they understand they cannot make it a back office activity forever, which in most of the customers B2B, it's a back office activity. And all of them are working on different versions of end user enablement. The end user will decide which data they want and what data they want to look. The end user can activate, deactivate sensors and whatever they have in their landscape. And the entire, and it's also a different audience. Talking about personas, the persona of the enterprise procurement, the enterprise tech team, and so on, are much younger. They're used to the self-service Amazon experience, and they want it at the tip of their fingers, and they don't want any back office interface. They want everything as a self-serve.
Right. Agreed.
Yeah. Andy, if you want to jump back actually to one of the 3 circle slides for a second. No, the one more back. One more back. Sorry, thank you. So I think this actually is a good sort of visual for this sort of problem. Like, so for decades, right? Technology has sort of been, and the sort of capabilities that we're able to deliver has been largely constrained by the feasibility circle, right? What it was feasible to deliver, right? Yeah. And a lot of times the experiences that we built and the decisions we made were over-indexed on what we were able to do and what we were able to know, right? So the sort of analytics-driven, sort of data-driven decisions we would make was constrained by what are the types of analytics that we could possibly gather, right? And it was a subset of what we would like to know, right? But we used that to the best we could, right? And what you're talking about here is that some of those feasibility constraints are going away, right? It is far more likely, right, that we can instrument far more parts of our business processes than we ever could before, right? And we've seen that in digital business. This is not a new problem here. Like big data, like for digital oriented businesses, right, has been a challenge for years, right? For 5 years now, for almost a decade now, we've been able to gather more data than we know what to do with, right? And so the focus has shifted, right, towards the analysis and the insights we're able to drive from that, right? And what 5G is doing is that it's moving that same problem out of the digital domain and into the physical domain, right? So processes that manufacturing and real world processes, right, are going to be faced by the same things that digitally oriented businesses have been dealing with for the past 10 years.
Agreed.
And what that really does, right, is it puts all the more need to focus on that desirability circle, right? And that's sort of what Hagai was talking about there, like really understanding, right, what are the insights we need to drive, right? What are the insights that are going to actually yield material benefit, and focus our attention and our resources on those, right? So that we do the right thing. Because there is still a very, very real constraint, right? And that is human attention, right? And human value, right? 5G is not going to fix that, right? There's still 24 hours in a day, and there's still only so many things we can focus on. And doubling down on that desirability circle, right, becomes crucial now that the constraints offered by that feasibility circle start to melt.
And Nathan, to build on your wonderful desire to put frameworks that look like frameworks next to frameworks, the one that would fit next to this perfectly, and the one that the last time I saw two Bens living next to each other, was really systems thinking, right? And the world is made up of physical systems, which we have long been able to master, create, build. We've been doing that throughout the course of human history, right? Then now we have technological systems, right? And those are the ones that we've been mastering across the 20th century and the post-industrial age. And the other system that lives in that Ben is human systems. And now all of a sudden, physical systems, technological systems, and human systems are all going to be interconnected. So Jim, that can make you scared. It can also give you goosebumps, right? Which is like my main KPI, because I think this is what's about to happen, which is where you're gonna bring alignment to our ability to impact physical systems, technological systems, to catch up with what humans can do, right? And once those things bring together, genuinely in a new age, and it's really the realization of 5G that's going to do that. So you're kind of sitting in a sweet spot, all you all.
We believe that, and my colleague was joking when he said he was afraid of 5G, but when you actually peel the onion on it, everything you guys just said really hits the concern that he and likely other peers of his, at his level also have as well, right? Which is, God, it's just there's so much data coming at us, even as consumers. In this arena example that you guys had talked about earlier, how many times are you at when we could go to an arena where people have their heads buried in their mobile phones and not necessarily watching the game or the concert or whatever that is, and so there's just this there's just going to be this pervasive exposure to new experiences, new data. And his point validly was, how the hell can I make sense of all this? More importantly, how do I use all this data to proactively automate my own systems? And that's a big question. Anyways, Kurt, I'm sorry to take more time than I asked, but
no, it's quite all right. It's a fascinating conversation. And so just a quick comment. I was in a very large organization doing software development where these processes broke down, right? So I applaud you guys for a very modern view of good product management, good product marketing discipline, right? Because this is all about perspectives, right? And when you get into political fights inside of a large company and you don't have those perspectives, you miss on products, right? And I won't even name the name. We all know who it is that I'm talking about, but that company went through an era, right, where you separated all these concentric circles out, right, and they would go off into their silos, and because of that, they missed markets, right? They either missed on that desirability or the viability pieces of it, and this happened over a period of about 10 years at Microsoft. Oops, there I said it. And what happened is that it took the right leadership to bring those people back together, and it's all about gaining perspectives to actually hit the mark, right? That concentric circle in the middle of your circles here is all about hitting the mark, right? Which is all about gaining perspective. So, and I love this kind of modern view of it, and it's really good to see it. One question I have specifically on the desirability. How much have you seen when you're working with the enterprise segment, right? And you're working on this, how does a startup get engaged in this process of enterprise development thinking, right? So that they can be part of that desirability or part of that consideration set for as enterprises are thinking about building solutions, whether it's internally or in partnership with startup solutions that become a component of some of the enterprise solutions that are being developed. Have you seen successful ways for startups to penetrate into this thinking process, right? So that because this is the best way and probably the easiest way for them to really create value for an enterprise. Anyway, I'll take a step.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the process of innovation, and I love your question, Kurt, because actually a lot of times I'm talking to big corporations and helping them to think more like startups, right? So it's very interesting, the perspective and who it needs. But I think, where we're coming to, and in this process of innovation, like it's about change. It's about doing new things in new ways. And really, at some point, there's some real good principles that generally drive innovation, right? Like, especially in a big organization, right? It almost always starts with a champion. It certainly has to be inside of a culture that can support that. And I think that's what you're talking about with like leadership transitions. And I think that company you named, like, look where they are today, right? Like, wow, they've been through the whole gamut and back again, and now they're back to really being at the bleeding edge. But what it comes back to, in addition to that champion, is you've got to very quickly get to the point where you're working on co-creation. And inside of a corporation, that generally happens through co-funding. And kind of bringing groups together. It almost always takes a third party to come in and bring focus. And what you want to do is get pilots that are on roadmaps, right? So you're talking about like getting into that first process. We talked about the hypotheses, and starting to build against that. But to talk about this point you're making, right? Like the startup and the big corporation. I think the new world is not that discrete anymore. And really, we're at a point where the marriage between the large corporations who have platforms and tools and systems, and them being brought to the innovation that's happening for the entrepreneurial level, whether it's within the organization and happening with innovation there, or it's the merger of a startup, and that. I mean, hopefully we don't live in a world anymore where the big corporations are just hoovering up the startups, right? Hopefully it's much more of this spirit of collaborative work, because I think that's what's going to really fuel innovation moving forward.
Roger said something I thought was really interesting in there is part of that, there's going to be champions of innovation inside of the enterprise, right? So for a startup, find who those are and find your way into these thinking processes that you're describing, right? Because once you do that, and if you can embed yourself as a startup early in that process to be part of this internal process that goes on inside of the enterprise, you've created a really unique position and a strong moat for your future inside of that enterprise in terms of the ability for them to leverage your product. So I like the view.
Yeah, it's great. Any more questions?
Well, let me just and one final thing, right? So the other sort of point I'd make, Kurt, is that for startups, right, part of the challenge there is just being ruthlessly pragmatic, right? So the tools and techniques that enterprises use to measure and assess desirability are probably not going to be the same tools and techniques that startups can use, right? So the thinking is the same and the process is the same, but the methods may be different, right?
Yep.
Enterprises may have the luxury of having a large customer install base already, right? And they can intuit information through analytics, and they can do large qualitative or quantitative surveys to their customers to assess what they need.
That's right.
And like a pre-launch startup is not going to have those tools available to them, and need to find other ways, like more qualitative, in-depth customer surveys, right? Like you find a small subset of your prospective customers and you do in-depth interviews with them, right, to understand their needs and their pain points.
I like that view, Nathan, because that's what I was thinking. Is like you as a startup have to figure out how you have to understand their system thinking for this process, right, and figure out how you embed yourself in it.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, look, this section is almost like a coda, but so far we've talked about a way of working, right, building the right thing, and inside of that, what we talked about was bringing the user to the front of the process and thinking about the end state and starting there. And how do you bring what the user needs and your requirements together so that you start from this point that is incredibly informed? And along with that, you bring your team, right? So that you're working in a really collaborative, cross-functional fashion. We've talked about mindsets, which are essentially designing for user outcomes and being very focused on that user through that process and the tools and techniques that allow you to do that. We're doing this ultimately for a very simple reason. This concept of experience, right? This is the ethereal layer around the product you're making, the technology that you have. It is the thing that ultimately connects to your customer, to your employee. And it can be as simple as a UI, but it is often much more than that. And so really, ultimately, the things that we've been talking today, while they are incredibly complex and it is hard work, the principles that drive them are very simple. And the role of experience is really about building trust. So first and ultimately with your user, pop to the next slide, Andy. When you're designing for the user, you're thinking about things that are super laser focused on these types of concepts. Ease of use. What is your user's needs and mindsets, and how do you use those to build what needs to be there? You've got to have familiarity. What is the job to be done, and how is the person going about it? Those are the types of things, understanding, that really unlock the things that can be the most important parts to inform, for example, like a design language system that's controlling a whole suite of software. And really, you're involved in this act of simplification. You're making, with your experience, what is otherwise a complex piece of technology or system accessible to this person who has to interact with it. And finally, when you really start to get to this, you can get to the emotional layer, right? You can get beyond the functional layer and you can start to make complex, really interesting interactions with your customer or your employee that allows you to sort of electrify what's going on. So these are sort of the thematics that are happening at the individual level. When we jump to the next slide, this is what happens when you do that at scale. When you are using this design process, when you are being focused on leading with your users' needs, it gives you power to have impact. There are very important things that can happen in here. One, and a big one, is accessibility. 1 in 4 adults is in some way differently abled. So when we're designing in an experience-driven way, you can help those people. You can make a difference, not just for your middle case, but the edge cases, and you can bring all of that together. When you are designing, you also have an impact on diversity, right? Like, it is incredibly important that we think about who is this product intended to serve. And if it is the world, if it is everyone, then the work that you do, the research that you do, has to start with that mindset, and the folks that you include have to look like the world. And then finally, the sort of ultimate level of superpower that you're trying to develop here is inclusiveness. And much of the history of design has been designing for people. What we are really moving to is designing with people. This is about making and creating a participatory process that is ultimately inclusive. And these arenas are where you're able to take your business, your product, and your service and have it do what you intended to do, but also make a greater impact on the world at large. And then finally, experiences matter. And I really, want to just get down to some basics. When you're working in this fashion, it has impact for your business. You are doing things about working smarter and not harder. You are reducing costs. You are improving your time to market. You are adding revenue, because ultimately it is experience that creates retention and increases the curve of adoption of your product. So no matter how great your product is, if it doesn't have a decent or great experience attached to it, you're going to have a harder time. And that goes back to that initial point that Andy talked about the 4%, right? And then finally, when you're working in this fashion, you have the ability to do more effective innovation. And that can be on the product that you're working on or whatever the next generation of it is. And those are the things that we wanted to bring to you today. So we'll just pause there and say thank you very much. But
thank you guys very much. This was very, very interesting. The conversation actually took many positive turns that I didn't anticipate. But as I have with your calls in the past, I always walk away with a lot more questions than I've had answers coming into it. So thank you. It's been provocative in a very good way. So thank you. We appreciate it. Yeah, sorry.
If anybody moving forward wants to have more of a one-on-one conversation with us or has really specific questions, please, reach out, and Jim, I think, we'll make sure everybody's in touch.
Absolutely. I was going to ask Rob, is it okay if we distribute this slide deck to the teams and then CC you on it? And at that point, if they'd like to reach out directly, they can?
Yeah, we'll send you a nice, lightweight, shareable PDF.
Awesome.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for your time today. You brought the team out. We really appreciate the opportunity to meet you all and get a perspective that you shared that we haven't, frankly, heard really from anyone else. And so we appreciate that insight. And we very much look forward to staying in touch and actually collaborating. So for the teams that are listening in today, we're early stages in some projects with Projekt202 and the team there that we believe is really going to help move this program forward in a really positive way. And we're excited to continue collaborating with you guys on that. Rob, thank you so much, and to the team for being available today. I had a snafu on the scheduling side, but Rob and the team were very gracious in actually moving the session forward an hour. And I can't thank you guys enough for that. So thank you so much.
Jim, this will be one of our favorite 8 a.m. hour meetings probably ever. Thank you.
We appreciate that.